Before we start, just a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. Only 2% are subscribed at 1,000 subscribers. I'll be posting a special video. The tub overflowed. I yanked the plug and grabbed the dress. Lace tore under my grip. Fabric sagged like a net full of stones. Lee stood by the faucet with one finger on the bottle. Enough, I snapped. She lifted her chin and squeezed another splash. I'm Mark 46. My hand shook while I hauled the weight. Water sloshed onto the floor. My shoes slipped and banged the rim. Turn it off, my voice echoed and sounded like someone older. Lee didn't move. Her eyes were steady and cold as winter roads. My sister pounded the door from the hall. Open now. Lee blocked me with a shoulder and a tight little smile. Move, I warned. She stayed planted, daring me to push through. I pushed. She stumbled one step and then planted again, stubborn. The dress ripped along the train, a long, ugly sound. I froze with fabric stretched in my fists like a rope. Lee watched the rip and breathed out slow, almost satisfied. I realized I was losing control, and she knew it. My sister forced the door and saw the disaster in one sweep. She reached for the dress. I lifted it clear and away. Don't touch it, I sounded brutal because panic made me blunt. Lee laughed once, a short bark like a switch being flipped. Why, I asked, the word bounced thin but cutting through the noise. Lee looked at the train with that same cool certainty. She deserves it, no flinch, no blink, just that flat judgment. My sister cursed. I felt something old snap behind my ribs. I hauled the dripping bundle to the counter and set it down. Water ran in a hard line and pooled against my wrist. Out, I told my sister. She stared and didn't budge an inch. Out, I repeated lower. She stepped back and clutched the frame. Lee rolled the faucet closed with slow, deliberate turns. Click, click. The room went quiet except for the drain and my breathing. Explain, I said. She lifted the bottle and tapped the label. Actions have consequences. She sounded like she was quoting me. Not like this. The thought landed sharp enough to sting. I wiped my palms on a towel and faced her square. You planned this, I said, keeping my voice level and clear. She shrugged. That shrug told me everything I didn't want. A thread floated near the rip. My sister reached again, shaking. I blocked her hand and met her eyes and held. If you touch it now, we make it worse, I said. She swallowed the rage and stepped back, but it hovered. Lee leaned against the cabinet and watched us like a judge. I pointed at the bottle. Set it down. She set it down. Keys, I said. She stiffened. Phone, she slid it across. Control returned in small inches, but I needed yards. Get a bag, I told my sister, keeping my eyes on Lee. Careful, I added, because haste would shred the seams further. Lee folded her arms and drummed a nail against her elbow. The sound cut through my nerves like a metronome for disaster. I lifted the train and guided it into the bag with care. Threads clung to my knuckles, each one felt like a choice. Lee watched the process as if we were loading evidence. I could not tell if she wanted me to fail here. The bag sealed with a harsh zip. My sister exhaled shakily. She nodded once and then turned away before tears started. Out to the car, I said, keeping the orders coming. If I paused, everything would fall apart in front of us. Lee stepped toward the door. I blocked her and stood firm. You ride with me, I said, not asking and not bluffing. Her lips pressed together, then she gave a tiny theatrical bow. The bow burned worse than the damage because it mocked us. We walked past the hallway mirror. I didn't look at myself. Shadows jumped on the walls as we moved fast toward the exit. My sister cradled the bag like a wounded thing that might kick. Lee trailed behind, light steps like she owned the pace. At the driveway, my sister's hands shook so hard she stopped. I took the bag and set it gently in the back. She looked at Lee and then at me and breathed fire. Fix this, she said, voice raw, or I cancel everything. Lee gave a tiny shrug again. My teeth locked against a shout. Get in, I told her. She slid into the passenger seat. I shut the door harder than planned and the frame rattled. I felt the next decision waiting, heavier than the dress. The engine caught. Lee stared through the windshield without blinking. My sister stayed in the driveway, holding her arms tight. I glanced at the rear view and saw a future snapping shut. I gripped the wheel and chose the one lever I still controlled. College fund, I said, calm because anger would miss. Lee's head turned a fraction, not much but enough. You're not touching it, her voice tried to sound bored. I drove forward, and her certainty finally cracked at the edges. We cleared the block, Lee shifted and tapped the door twice. I kept my eyes on the road and counted the taps aloud. 1, 2, the habit annoyed her so she stopped tapping. Smell. L victories never felt smaller, yet they mattered right now. You think she deserved it, I said, forcing my breath slow. Lee didn't answer, her jaw tightened and she looked away. Silence gathered between us like a loaded room with no exits. I let it grow because silence sometimes pushes truth into daylight. 3 turns later, Lee reached for the radio and then paused. Her hand hovered, then fell to her lap like a staged surrender. I understood the gesture, she wanted control back without words. I held my line because giving it would cost everything later. The bank envelope waited at home, I felt its weight already. Not the paper, the promise, my promise, years of saving. Lee knew that, she had counted along with me before. I would count again, and this time the numbers would cut. We hit a red light, Lee finally looked at me fully. No going back, her tone challenged and pleaded in the same breath. There is forward, I said, eyes on the changing signal. The light flipped green and I drove toward the reckoning. The front door swung and I went straight for the lockbox. Lee trailed 2 steps behind, feet light, breath even. I set the metal down and waited for her to blink. She didn't, I turned the key and felt resolve harden. The envelope lay where I'd left it after years of discipline. I broke the seal and spread the bills in a clean line. Lee watched my hands like a referee watches a foul. Count it, I told myself out loud because doubt creeps fast. 1, my voice carried farther than the room deserved. 2, she crossed her arms and looked past me on purpose. 3, I slowed the rhythm so every number hit. Her jaw flexed once, then settled into stone. She reached and I covered the stack with my palm. Not yours, my hand stayed still, my pulse didn't. You're bluffing, she tried to smile but it faltered. I lifted the entire roll and slipped it into my pocket. Where now? She tipped her chin, daring me to flinch. A place you can't touch. I opened the safe again. I pulled a blank deposit slip and stared at the lines. Even paper can feel heavy when it changes a path. Keys rattled in the hallway, and Dana stopped at the threshold. Her gaze moved from Lee to the open box, then me. What happened here? She planted a hand on the frame. Lee's eyes flicked to mine, asking if I'd break. I didn't recap anything, I pointed to the empty slot. I'm moving it, I said, voice steady enough to carry. Dana drew a slow breath and counted my knuckles like beads. This is permanent, she warned, because warnings land like anchors. Nothing's permanent, I answered, though my gut felt welded. Lee took a thin step forward, hungry for any weakness. No, wait, she said, softer now, finally calculating risk. The new tone told me we finally reached the real fight. Dana held out her palm, and Lee gave up her phone. I asked for keys next, and she hesitated just long enough. They dropped into my hand with a hollow clack that stung. Limits were set, but limits only work if enforced. We're going to the bank, I said, grabbing my jacket. Lee opened her mouth and then closed it without a sound. Dana looked between us and swallowed whatever plea she had. Take the receipt, she said, making the accountability real. We drove again, tighter now, air thin with unspoken charges. Lee stared forward and pinched her sleeve until her nail whitened. She wanted a different verdict, and I recognized that hunger. I kept to the lane and let the silence pressure cook. At the counter, I filled the slip with slow, neat strokes. Lee stood beside me, posture rigid, eyes fixed on nothing. I slid the cash under glass and kept my face blank. The drawer shut with a final thud that emptied my lungs. Back in the car, Lee tried a new strategy with poise. I can repay half by graduation, she looked straight ahead. Not enough, I said, because half doesn't rebuild trust. She nodded once like she'd expected that wall and planned more. Then give me tasks that matter, her voice finally lost steel. I heard fatigue instead of triumph, and it almost moved me. Start with the dress, I said, letting the word hang. She rolled her shoulders and the fight returned in sparks. Tonight, I added the deadline like a weight on the line. She flinched, small, quick, then smoothed her face to neutral. Do you want her to know yet? She studied the dashboard. She'll know when you show up with work, not excuses. We turned onto our street and saw a car waiting crooked. My sister stepped out and folded her arms against her chest. Her mouth was a thin line that promised a storm. Lee's fingers tightened and I braced for a collision. Is it gone? My sister looked at me, not Lee. It's protected. I kept my voice clipped and clean. Lee glanced down and then raised her chin again. We're heading to repairs, I added, because action beats apology. My sister opened the back door and checked the garment quietly. She didn't cry, she cataloged damage like a surgeon before cutting. Shop closes in an hour, she said, turning toward her wheel. Lee moved first, and that movement mattered more than any promise. We followed, intersections flashed by like checkpoints I had to clear. No music, no chatter, only the hum of consequences catching up. Lee pressed her palms together and breathed through her nose. I recognized endurance training, which meant she knew this would hurt. The seamstress met us with tight lips and a measured nod. She lifted the fabric, eyes scanning, fingers quick and precise. This can be salvaged, she said, but the next line cut. It will cost time and attention, and both belong to you. Lee stepped to the counter and owned the sentence without wobble. I'll be here, she promised, and it sounded like a contract. Every day until done, she didn't look at me for approval. For the first time today, she reached for responsibility instead of control. I handed over the receipt from the bank like a pledge. Materials on me, labor on her. The division felt right. The seamstress pocketed it and pointed toward a stool and needles. Lee sat, and the first lesson started with pricked skin. I stood back and kept still, while minutes hardened into intent. Each stitch drew a faint line toward something that might hold. My sister watched, arms loosened now, face wary but open. I felt a door somewhere creak, not closing, not yet. Thread snapped, Lee winced and reached for a fresh strand. Keep pressure, the tailor muttered, eyes on the torn edge. Lee pressed a pad to her fingertip and went right back. She didn't look at me, and that silence buzzed like a fuse. My phone vibrated, Dana's name filled the screen like a verdict. Out front now, her voice landed hard and didn't wait. I stepped outside and found her pacing by the curb. What line did you cross today? She asked, shoulders tense and squared. I secured the funds, I answered, keeping it clipped and plain. And you put our kid to work, she fired, breath short. Inside, Lee's hands moved, deliberate, steady, learning under pressure. This isn't punishment, I said, it's repair, and the word bit. Dana rubbed her brow, then pointed at the shop through the glass. That's a girl on a cliff, she whispered, steady but fierce. She's capable, I countered, though doubt tugged hard at the edges. Capable breaks too, she shot back, and the warning stuck. The door opened a crack, Lee leaned out without breaking pace. Text for you, she said, and slid the phone into my palm. A screenshot glowed, bridesmaids laughing about her dress last week. One line circled, she'll ruin photos, the same cut, sharper now. Why show this now, I asked, because timing tells the truth. Lee lifted a shoulder, eyes already back on the needle. You wanted cause, she said, then returned to the fabric. Dana stared at the screen and let that line burn. My sister pulled up fast, tires crunching against the curb. She approached, saw the screenshot, and didn't bother denying it. I'll own my part, she said, jaw iron, gaze straight ahead. But that gown still needs saving, and she moved past us. Inside, the tailor laid out tasks like a drill instructor. Hand based here, reinforce there, don't overpull, quick and crisp. Lee matched the cadence and fell into rhythm without protest. My sister hovered, quiet at last, watching the work answer. A pin fell, Lee retrieved it before it rolled too far. Tiny motion, big meaning, because details decide whether this holds. Time tomorrow, the tailor asked, eyes cutting to Lee's face. Dawn, Lee answered, and the commitment sounded like a stake. Dana exhaled and leaned against the door with a tight grip. After this we talk, she warned, voice low but immovable. Not a threat, a plan, I nodded and held that line. The tailor cleared her throat and pointed to a fresh panel. We stayed until closing, hands raw, backs tight, tempers contained. The dress looked less broken, not whole, but trending upward. My sister studied the seams like a pilot checks a wing. Make it wearable by rehearsal, she said, and left it hanging. On the ride home, Lee's posture didn't sag or plead. "I'll handle tomorrow," she murmured, eyes straight, pulse visible at her neck. "Not alone," I answered, because supervision mattered more than comfort. She didn't argue, which told me the fight had shifted. At the house, Dana set 3 chairs at the table. "Ground rules," she began, palms flat, gaze moving between us. "Schedule, costs, apology at rehearsal, no side comments, no theatrics." Lee twirled a spare thread, then let it drop like surrender. "Money stays locked," I said, meeting Lee's stare without blinking. "Earn steps reopen pieces," I added, and Dana nodded once. "Define earned," Lee asked, voice careful, tone lighter than earlier. "Hours logged, materials repaid, die." "Rect apology received," I answered, unblinking. "Add 1, Dana said, delete every nasty post before midnight." Lee paused, scrolled, and started clearing feeds in quick bursts. Not performative, efficient, focused, damage control as muscle memory. I watched the numbers fall and felt a meter ticking down. My sister texted a new photo, progress shot, pins everywhere. Lee studied it and pointed out 2 weak joins without prompting. "Good eye," Dana murmured, and the praise made Lee swallow. She looked away, then back, like praise was a hot surface. "Rehearsal is Friday," I said, letting the countdown tighten the room. "You speak first when we arrive," I added, because ownership matters. Lee nodded, one clean motion, no wobble, no defense. "Fine," she said, and that single word landed like a seal. We broke for sleep, but I didn't drift quickly. A sound from Lee's room, faint, rhythmic, paper against paper. I walked past and saw flashcards lined in disciplined rows. She was training her mouth to say the right words. Before dawn, the alarm cut the dark and we moved. Lee grabbed a thermos and a small bandage kit without fuss. Dana handed her a protein bar and a look that meant fight smart. We headed back, and the road felt narrower than yesterday. Outside the shop, a bridesmaid waited with folded arms. "Here to watch," she announced, chin high, menace hidden under cheer. Lee faced her and held the stare until the smile died. "Here to help," the bridesmaid muttered, then stepped inside quieter. The tailor assigned stations, clipped and precise, no wasted motion. Lee handled the delicate section, while the bridesmaid ran support. My sister ferried lengths between tables without commentary or glare. I tracked hours and costs on a notepad that would decide later. A needle bent, Lee swapped tools fast and kept momentum. The bridesmaid tried to joke, then read the room and stopped. "Thank you for coming," Lee said, short and sincere, eyes steady. The bridesmaid nodded, cheeks flushed, and finally put her hands in. By noon, structure returned to the train in careful lines. The tailor lifted the hem and tested for pull under strain. "It'll hold," she said, then added, "if no one panics later." We all heard later, and the warning settled in deep. We paused for water. Dana texted a check-in and a heart. Lee stared at it longer than a normal message deserves. She tucked the phone away and resumed with sharper focus. I recognized grit and feared where it came from. Closing time again, the dress looked almost ready to rehearse. My sister touched the edge and breathed out something between relief and dread. "Tomorrow decides everything," she murmured, eyes on Lee's hands. "Tomorrow always does," and I braced for whatever broke next. The zipper popped during the test run, a sharp, unforgiving snap. My sister stiffened and clutched the bodice like it might bolt. Lee reached the back first and pinned the gap with quick hands. "Hold still," her voice carried authority I hadn't heard before. The alterations lead lifted an eyebrow and tapped the open seam. "We can stabilize for rehearsal," she said, already sorting tasks. Lee nodded once and took the toolkit without waiting for permission. I stepped back so I wouldn't shake the room with nerves. Rehearsal started late, and whispers arrived on time. Screens flashed in pockets, group chats pinged with recycled jokes. A bridesmaid glanced at Lee and then hid behind a tight smile. I felt the heat rise across my neck and chose not to answer. Lee stood at the aisle and raised a hand for silence. "I damaged the gown," she said, voice clear, shoulders squared. "I'm fixing it now, and I'll cover the fallout." Murmurs rolled, then thinned when my sister lifted 2 fingers. A groomsman smirked and muttered something about karma on loop. Lee's mouth tensed, then relaxed as if she swallowed glass. "Focus on your cue," I told him, a flat, controlled warning. He looked away first, which mattered more than anything he said. The planner walked over with a clipboard like a warrant. Rush repair requires a deposit and a liability note. I pulled the bank slip and set it on the table. Materials covered, labor belongs to Lee, put that in writing. Lee took the pen and signed her full name without shaking. Daily hours logged, payment plan attached, immediate breach resets everything. The planner scanned it and nodded, satisfied but still watchful. Accountability felt real on paper, which meant pressure everywhere else. We ran the entrance again, train lifted, corners cleared, timing tight. On the turn, the lace brushed a rough edge and hitched. Lee caught it mid-snag and shifted her grip with precision. Applause broke out short and relieved, then died as eyes recalculated. My sister pulled me aside behind the arrangement and spoke low. People know about the bleach, she warned, guilt and anger mixed. They also know you fro. Her college fund, the word hung heavy. Own the plan tonight or gossip owns tomorrow. Lee heard that last part and stepped into the gap. Group chat now, she told the bridesmaids with a firm nod. She opened her phone and started clearing posts one by one. No retweets, no screenshots, if you saved any, delete them. One bridesmaid hesitated and muttered about jokes and freedom. Lee stared her down until the screen clicked and the feed emptied. Thank you, she added, quiet but final, and moved back to work. I watched the resistance break like ice under careful weight. I texted Dana a status and a picture of the seam. She answered with a new rule and a clear timestamp. Home by 10, back at 6, no exceptions. I pocketed the phone and prepared to enforce every minute. Final pass before dismissal, dress on, veil set, steps counted. The alterations lead traced the panel where the rip had lived. This section fails if it gets stressed during photos, she warned. Lee lifted her hand. I will reinforce it tonight. My sister's eyes softened, then sharpened, then steadied on Lee. You stand next to me at rehearsal dinner, she instructed. You speak again, not for drama, for closure. Lee answered with a crisp nod, and I felt the room exhale. The groomsman approached with a paper cup and forced friendliness. Peace offering, he joked, eyes flicking to the camera crew. Lee didn't take it. Be decent without props, she replied. He backed off and the crew found another angle. I pulled Lee aside near the garment rack and laid terms. This isn't restoration of the fund, this is a pathway. Checklist, hours, receipts, direct service until the wedding ends. She extended her hand, then changed it to a short, disciplined nod. We packed the gown with 2 guards on the zipper. The planner sealed the bag and set a strict timetable. Door locks at 9, if you're late, come back at dawn. Lee checked her watch and mouthed the numbers like a vow. Back at the shop, the lights buzzed and the machines hummed. Lee slid into the station, eyes on the weak panel. Teach me the reinforcement stitch, she asked, tone all business. The lead craftsman demonstrated once, and Lee mirrored the motion. Needle in, loop, draw tight, not hidden beneath the trim. She repeated the sequence until her hands found a rhythm. When the thread snagged, she didn't curse or pause. She breathed once and started the move again with control. Near closing, a courier dropped an invoice higher than expected. I scanned the total and felt my gut protest in silence. Lee read over my shoulder and tapped the extra line. Rush surcharge, I'll cover it with Saturday shifts, she stated. You will not work Saturday during the ceremony, the planner cut. Lee corrected herself without flinching, Sunday and evenings after school. She signed the addendum and underlined the due dates twice. The craftsman watched and gave a curt approving nod. We stopped only when the door latch clicked for the night. The panel looked strong, not perfect, but ready for a trial. Lee flexed her fingers and checked the line like a pilot. We're close, she said, and I finally believed her grit. Outside, the same bridesmaid waited by the curb with red eyes. I deleted everything, she blurted, voice rough, hands shaking. I told them to drop it and some did. Lee offered a short thanks and asked for 2 hours of quiet. We drove home under a sky that did not care at all. Dana met us at the entry with a stopwatch and a hug. 10 on the dot, she noted, eyes cutting to my pocket. I kept the envelope in place and let the rule stand. Before bed, Lee laid 3 checklists on the counter in rows. Rehearsal speech, morning reinforcement, payment log. She pushed a pen toward me and waited for a signature. I signed, and the promise felt heavier than the cash ever did. My phone buzzed once more as I turned out the light. A message from my sister with 2 words only. Thank you, followed by a photo of the seam holding. I stared at it and knew the next break would test us harder. The rehearsal dinner started with a microphone shoved into Lee's hands. She didn't look at me, she looked at my sister and inhaled once. I caused damage, no flourish, just impact. I'm repairing what I broke. Forks paused midair, the room tilted toward her next sentence like a trap. A cousin rolled her eyes and whispered karma again under her breath. Lee didn't chase it. If I miss a stitch, I fix it. If I hurt you, I show up until it's right. She stopped there, which made the silence lean harder for more. My sister stepped forward and touched Lee's wrist for a beat. Thank you, she said into the mic, voice tight but direct. We're on schedule and I expect everyone to support that. Eyes dropped to plates, the message landed like a nail. The planner pointed at me from across the room and crooked a finger. She presented a clipboard with additional insurance boxes unchecked. Coverage for night storage, she said, tone brisk and unforgiving. I initialed 3 squares because we could not afford another surprise. Dana slid next to Lee and set a timer on her phone. 10 minutes to eat, she murmured, then tapped the screen twice. Back to the shop after dessert, she added, gaze unwavering. Lee nodded without sarcasm and kept chewing like fuel mattered. A groomsman tried to toast with a smirk and an off-color joke. I raised my glass and cut in before the punchline landed. Grateful for the crew working overtime, I said, eyes on him. He lowered his drink and found something interesting on the floor. Midway through dessert, the photographer approached with practiced politeness. I need dress access before dawn for detail shots. My sister checked the planner, then checked Lee's expression. 2 hours at the shop before sunrise, my sister decided no wiggle. Lee's phone buzzed and she glanced down once. The bridesmaid from earlier texted a screenshot of a new rumor. Someone posted that the gown was ruined beyond saving. Lee typed just 3 words back, watch rehearsal tomorrow. I walked Lee to the exit while plates clattered behind us. You did not bargain tonight, I said, keeping my tone even. You took responsibility and stopped. She kept pace and stayed quiet. That restraint told me she understood the stakes better now. At the shop, the tailor had laid out a final checklist. Reinforce the zipper guard, smooth the bodice lines, anchor the bustle. Lee grabbed the thimble and lined up the tasks like targets. No chatter, only the steady cadence of work landing clean. The zipper reinforcement started smooth, then the needle snapped mid-pull. Lee froze only for a heartbeat, then reached for a replacement. Don't yank, the tailor warned, eyes never leaving the fabric. Lee adjusted pressure and found that precise glide the piece needed. An aunt barged in with loud opinions and a critical stare. This is performative, she announced, tossing her scarf over one shoulder. Children shouldn't face public shame. Lee didn't look up. I'm not hiding, I'm working, and the aunt deflated. The invoice printer sputtered and pushed out another charge slip. Overtime fee, security fee, after-hours surcharge, each line sharpened. I did the math and felt the margin buckle inside my chest. Dana checked the totals and squeezed my elbow once. We'll manage. A courier arrived with last-minute clips for the bustle mechanism. The parts were wrong by 2 millimeters and threatened the whole system. Lee measured 3 times and improvised a spacer from scrap. The solution held under a firm tug, but barely. The planner called from the curb with a rapid update. Venue changed the aisle width by 6 inches, she announced. That alters how the train moves at the turn. Lee mapped it mentally and adjusted the fold pattern on the spot. We ran a hallway simulation with tape and a steady beat. Lee walked the path and tested the pivot with the new fold. The fabric rolled clean across the corner without a snag. The tailor exhaled, then circled a spot that still scared her. Anchor here, she instructed, tapping the lower junction twice. Lee added a hidden brace with small, accurate bites. She tugged once, twice, the brace didn't give. The tailor finally gave a thumbs up that looked earned. My sister arrived with the shoes and a look that meant business. Try the full outfit, she said, chin high, shoulders squared. She stepped into the gown while Lee crouched on the floor. Hook after hook clicked into place like a lock engaging. The moment the bodice settled, a loop popped near the back. Not catastrophic, dangerous if ignored. Lee slid a hook under the loop and rebuilt it with patience. My sister didn't flinch, which helped the fix hold. While they tested the walk, the florist's assistant appeared with a crate. This bouquet shed all morning, she whispered, panic leaking into the words. She asked to stash backups in the storage room overnight. The planner allowed it and wrote the permission on the schedule. I watched Lee clock every moving part and make micro choices. She shifted the bustle connection by 1 notch for weight balance. She shortened a side ribbon so the turn wouldn't twist. Each change stole a failure point from whatever tomorrow would throw. A bridesmaid arrived late with red eyes and a handful of pins. I want to help, but I don't know how, she said. Lee gave her a simple job, threading needles in a neat row. Small task, big difference, the room calmed by a fraction. A text pinged from an unknown number and I opened it. Anonymous gossip account asking for a quote on the Bleach story. I blocked the number and showed Lee the screen. She nodded once, jaw tight, and tightened another anchor. Near midnight, the seam along the side panel lifted slightly. Not a tear, a warning. Lee caught it and reinforced the run with ladder stitches. The line lay flat again like it wanted to behave. Dana brought a small stack of protein bars and tapped her watch. 30 minutes more, she announced, eyes soft but rules intact. Lee chewed and stitched and kept the tempo. I realized consequences had become routine, which terrified me a little. We finished the checklist and loaded the garment into the transport case. The planner sealed it with numbered tags and snapped a photo. Chain of custody, she said, and my shoulders loosened by degrees. Tomorrow's failure would not be on paperwork at least. On the way out, the building alarm glitched and screamed. Security rushed in and demanded badges like we were thieves. The planner flashed permits while Lee stood silent and steady. They checked the tags and let us pass with a warning. We drove straight to the venue for a timed drop. The guard scanned the case and logged the arrival with a stamp. He asked if the bride knew about the Bleach rumor. My sister looked him in the eye, she knows the plan. Back home, we didn't speak in the hallway. Lee set 3 alarms and taped the schedule above her desk. Dana hung the suit for tomorrow and kissed my cheek once. I put the bank receipt under the paperweight and tried to breathe. I couldn't sleep, I reviewed every requirement like a pilot checklist. Funds secured, tasks documented, speech delivered without theatrics. Lee's posture shifting from defiance to service, moment by moment. Progress was real, but something still waited to crack. At 4, we were up and moving with barely a word. We met the photographer at the gate and signed the access log. He worked fast and demanded stillness during the tight shots. Lee stood just off frame and watched for any pull. During the final detail capture, the zipper guard resisted. The camera operator paused and everyone held their breath. Lee stepped in with a tiny wedge and lifted the pressure. Again, the photographer said, and the guard behaved on command. He snapped the last frame and checked his screen twice. Perfect, he said with an exhausted grin, and the relief hit. Lee didn't smile, she studied the brace and tapped it once. Let's not touch it again until lineup. With an hour to spare, we regrouped in the prep room. The planner reviewed the timeline without pausing for pleasantries. Processional order, vows cue, photo pivot after the first kiss. Lee listened like a foreman and adjusted her own notes. My sister pulled Lee aside, then faced me with a steady look. I need her beside me until the doors open, she said. She keeps the dress calm, she keeps me calm. Lee nodded and planted herself at my sister's shoulder. The florist reappeared with the backup bouquet and a worried face. The other one wilted faster than expected, she admitted, whisper thin. Lee weighed both arrangements like solving a math problem. Use the backup for aisles, switch back for portraits, she concluded. 10 minutes before guests entered, a storm front tried to roll in. The planner checked a radar app and recalculated the atrium choice. Plan B pergola, she announced, then pointed at the floor manager. Lee whispered counts under her breath and studied the turn again. A new text hit my phone from an unknown contact. Refund her fund or we leak worse, the message threatened. I showed Dana and watched her mouth flatten into resolve. Report it, she said, and I forwarded it to the planner. The planner traced the number to a burner and shrugged. Noise, she said, then added, not nothing. She placed 2 ushers near the dress rack as a buffer. Lee noticed and moved closer to the case like a guard dog. 5 minutes to go, the efficient asked for any final logistical concerns. Lee lifted a finger and outlined 3 risk points in 30 seconds. Corner pivot P. Hodo crowding bouquet swap timing. The efficient listened, nodded, and adjusted the program cues. Then my sister's heel snapped during a practice step. She wobbled and grabbed the chair, eyes wide with panic. Lee hit the ground with a repair kit like she had rehearsed this. She stabilized the heel cap and tested it with 2 careful steps. The room held its breath. My sister stood again and walked. No wobble, no stumble. She looked at Lee with something that softened and deepened. Stay with me until the music starts, she whispered. I checked the time and felt the countdown hammer my ribs. Wallet, keys, receipt, schedule all in their places. I touched the envelope and left it there, cold and quiet. The rule stood even as Hope scratched at the door. A final alert buzzed from the venue security channel. Uninvited blogger at the entrance asking for a statement. The planner dispatched staff to redirect and block access. Lee kept her eyes on the case and never glanced up. The music cue tested once, then again, then went silent. Everyone took their positions while the air tightened. My sister pressed her palms together and closed her eyes. Lee lifted the train, and the seam held under that first rise. The doors cracked open for the first row of guests. I felt every choice I had made stacking behind me. College money locked, work logged, apology delivered without spin. It would either be enough or it would break in public. Ready, the planner whispered, hand raised like a starter pistol. Lee breathed in and met my eyes for a heartbeat. No defiance, no theater, only readiness and something like respect. The doors opened wider, and the day came roaring in. Music hit, the doors parted, and Lee lifted the train. I watched the seam ride the arch like a tightrope across wind. The first row stood, and every camera chased the entrance. My pulse hammered against the rule I had sworn to keep. 3 steps in, a toddler lurched from a pew and grabbed lace. Lee pivoted without breaking stride and freed the snag cleanly. My sister's balance held, chin high, gaze fixed on the aisle. The usher scooped the child away, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. At the midpoint, the bouquet swap window opened and vanished. Lee timed the exchange with 1 breath and 1 precise nod. Backup slid in, original tucked aside, momentum unbroken. Eyes tracked the motion, then shifted back to the vows. The efficient started, then the mic shrieked with brutal feedback. Guests flinched like a wave and the bride's shoulders jerked. Lee eased the train down, then covered the speaker with fabric. The squeal died and the ceremony recovered by inches. A breeze pushed through the pergola and tried to tug the veil. Lee anchored the edge with 2 fingers and a quiet count. Her hand trembled once, then steadied as the ribbon settled. The veil stopped fighting, and the next line landed clearly. Vows finished, the rings arrived, and one slipped from sweaty hands. It bounced toward the railing like a coin rolling to an edge. Lee shot a foot out and pinned it under her shoe. She retrieved it smoothly and passed it forward without flair. When the kiss ended, the crowd surged toward the aisle for photos. A heel nudged the train and threatened to twist the bustle. Lee raised her forearm, a simple barrier, and the movement paused. The planner whistled once, and the lane reopened like a gate. We moved into portraits, each pose a risk disguised as tradition. Lee breathed through the pivots and watched the stress points. A groomsman reached for the fabric with careless hands and swagger. She redirected him with a clipped hands high, and he yielded. The blogger slipped past security and lifted a phone toward the dress. I intercepted with my shoulder and looked straight through him. Exit is left, I said, making space that could not be argued. He backed away, filming my shoes instead of the bride. Couples photos finished, the planner herded us toward the reception hall. Lee shadowed the train through corridors like a bodyguard in heels. My sister kept whispering counts under her breath to stay calm. I stayed within reach in case the zipper even thought about rebelling. Grand entrance cued, the floor cleared, and the music kicked. Lee hovered near the edge and tracked the spin radius. On the third turn, a sequin scraped the floor and hesitated. She nudged the fabric a hair right, and the glide returned. Speeches started, and I felt every eye waiting for trouble. A cousin rose with a smirk and an old grudge simmering. Lee stared at her glass and refused to be bait. The cousin sat again when the room declined to laugh. My sister lifted the mic and gestured toward Lee without flourish. She saved today, she said, voice even, posture strong. She also broke something and chose to rebuild it in public. The crowd absorbed that truth, then applauded like adults. Lee stood without fanfare. Indy stepped beside the head table. I harmed someone I love, she began, tone quiet but direct. I work to make the harm smaller, and I'm not done. She paused once and let the weight sit where it belonged. No tears, no theatrics, only the plan and the result. She thanked the crew, then addressed the bridesmaids with a glance. Screens empty, rumors ended, help me keep it that way. Heads nodded in reluctant agreement, because the work had shown. A server tripped near the linen stack and toppled almost into us. Trays shuddered and crashed, and a sharp edge nicked the hem. Lee crouched instantly and patched with a discreet bind-off. 10 seconds, problem contained, applause bubbling into relief. I found Dana by the door and showed her the timer. Hours logged, conditions met, apology delivered twice with no backslide. Dana studied my face and pressed her thumb into my palm. Not the fund, she whispered, something else she can climb. Cake cutting arrived, a clean joy in a day of repairs. Lee stood just outside the circle and watched for snags. The knife caught frosting and brushed the dress near the hip. She moved the fabric before sugar could stick and stain. First dance approached, which scared me more than the vows. People step where they shouldn't when music pulls them. Lee flagged a crowded corner and asked the DJ to pivot. He changed the path with one nod, and congestion eased. Halfway through the dance, a prankster tried to pull a stunt. A streamer flew toward the bride like a childish dare. Lee plucked it midair and tucked it in her palm. She met the prankster's gaze until he shrank back into darkness. Photographer called for the final group shot before open floor. Lee tested the bustle with a thumb and listened for strain. It held not a whisper. She looked to me, and I answered with a single nod. Guests dispersed toward music and food with cautious happiness. My sister led Lee to a quiet corner near the arch. Debt ledger, my sister said, offering a folded sheet. Materials covered, hours recorded, balance due in chores and time. Lee read the lines, then wrote an amount with steady handwriting. Add a donation to the shop, she said, chin set with intent. The tailor blinked, surprised, then accepted the addition without argument. That small move tightened something inside me like a bolt seating. Dana pulled me toward the hallway and waited for me to breathe. You promised a pathway, not a pardon, she reminded me. I know, I answered, and I meant it with both hands. Tonight is a checkpoint, not a finish line. I returned to Lee with a single-page agreement in my pocket. She looked alert, wary, ready for another rule to land heavy. I held up the paper with a line drawn across the middle. Partial scholarship from me, earned per milestone, not unlocked by tears. Lee read the clauses twice, lips moving, eyes flicking up. Community college first year, part-time job, debt paid monthly. Mentorship at the shop on Saturdays for 3 months. She traced the final clause with her nail and held still. Violations pause the support, I said, making each word weigh. Finish these terms, and we revisit the remainder after summer. She looked toward the dance floor, then back to the signatures. Pen, she asked, and I offered it without commentary. She signed, I signed. Dana initialed the oversight section. My sister witnessed and dated the line with a firmer hand. The planner snapped a photo for the file and stored a copy. Accountability left the room with us, attached like a shadow. The DJ called for parents to join the floor. I ignored tradition and stayed near the arch with Lee. You hold the train for the father-daughter dance, I said. She blinked twice, then nodded, understanding what that meant. We walked out together as the couple stepped aside. Lee took her position behind the bride with practiced calm. I offered my arm to the groom's mother and forced a smile. The band started softer, and movement flowed without friction. During the bridge, the zipper guard flexed with a whispered protest. Lee spotted it and shifted the weight 1 inch left. The protest died, the brace did its job. I heard that tiny silence like a verdict lifting. Song ended, and the floor opened to everyone with open hands. Laughter finally sounded like laughter, not a cover for nerves. Lee untied the bustle for the bouquet throw and retied it after. Flawless, efficient, no drama, people noticed competence and shut up. Near the bar, the groomsman with the earlier smirk approached. He held out a napkin with a shaky apology scrawled across it. Lee read it and folded it into her pocket without comment. Not forgiven, not ignored, stored as evidence for later. Security pushed over with a last update on the blogger situation. He's gone, they reported, breathless, a little proud of themselves. Account already posted nonsense, but it's getting no traction. Lee opened the app and watched comments stall and cool. I pulled the key from my pocket and weighed it in my palm. The metal felt hotter than it should, like a test I might fail. Lee noticed and shook her head once, clear and calm. Keep it, she said, we're not done. We stayed through the final song and the send-off cheers. No new tears opened, no thread slipped, no cruel whispers rose. My sister hugged Lee with both arms and held longer than expected. Come tomorrow for cleanup, she requested, and Lee agreed immediately. Out by the curb, the planner handed over the last paperwork. Closeout complete, she told us, ticking the final box. She gave Lee a quiet salute, then turned to wrangle vendors. The night began to fold itself back into normal. At the car, Lee leaned against the door and stared at the street. Thank you for not rushing the fund, she said, voice low. Thank you for not rushing the apology, I answered, matching her tone. We stood there, letting the calm feel strange and earned. On the drive home, Lee scrolled past the last gossip post. She flagged the thread and filed a takedown request with receipts. Screens dimmed, noise faded. She exhaled and looked out at nothing in particular. We parked and she reached for the handle, then paused. Can I keep the signed copy? She asked, eyes clearer than before. Of course, I said, and handed it over without a lecture. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her jacket. Inside, Dana turned off the kitchen light and waited by the counter. Lee laid the agreement down like a trophy that wasn't shiny. Dana tapped the milestones with a fingertip and nodded once. Tomorrow morning breakfast, then shop, she said, setting the next rung. Lee headed to her room and closed the door with care. No slam, no stomp, just a quiet latch that felt new. I put the key back into the lockbox and didn't twist. It sat there heavy, patient, asking me to be the adult. I washed my hands and found thread lines etched into my skin. They would fade by Monday, but the lesson would not. I dried off and listened to the house breathe like it had exhaled. We had built something rough today, and it might hold. Before sleep, a final message pinged from my sister. Seemed perfect through last dance, the text read, short and weighty. Tell Lee she earned a seat at brunch. I smiled and left the key where it belonged, still waiting.